Hey guys, this is the Forex Price Action Trading Course Part 2. This is lesson number 3, bias changes with new pivot strength. Alright, let's get going. Okay, here's a lesson overview. Now first I'll be going over the basic paradigm of bias changes with new pivot strength, and moreover on how to trade these bias changes. And then I'll go on to a real bias change scenario. So in this section I'll be explaining a change in bias through new pivot strength that actually happened on the NZD-USD pair. Okay. Alright, the basic paradigm of bias changes with new pivot strength. Number 1. If new pivot strength is stronger than the last pivot, it will change the bias along with the target and stop loss levels. Alright, so here's a weekly chart of the NZD-USD pair. So let's say we measure the future short strength of this pivot against the future long strength of this pivot, and we found that there's more long strength than short strength. Thus that simultaneously states that price is likely to reach this pivot high before reaching this pivot low. So another way to put these two levels is that the main stop loss level is right here, while the main target is at this level right here. And so in this section right here, we will be looking for long trades on the lower time frames. However, let's say in this pivot right here, we found that there's actually more short strength than the last long pivot's long strength. So at this point, the bias changed to short. Or in other words, price is likely to reach this pivot low right here before reaching this pivot high. So as well as a bias change from long to short, the main targets and stop loss levels also change. So at this point where there's new pivot strength in the bias change to short, the main stop loss level became this price level here, and the main target level became here. Alright, so in this way, when there's a bias change through new pivot strength, first of all, the bias will change from long to short, and moreover, the main stop loss level and the main target level will also change. Alright, so now let's see how we would trade this market on the lower time frames after this weekly bias change through new pivot strength. Okay. Alright, number 2. If trend trading, acknowledge the higher time frames bias and find pivots in which the bias aligns with the higher time frames bias. Alright, so on this weekly chart, we found that we should be long bias in this area and short bias in this area. So if we were trading this, we would go on the lower time frames and find pivots where there is more long strength than short strength. And moreover, in this area right here, after the bias change on the lower time frames, we're looking for pivots with more short strength than long strength. Alright, so let's go over to the daily chart. Alright, so on this daily chart, the weekly bias was long in this area right here, while the weekly bias was short in this area right here. And so on this daily chart, we want to find pivots where the bias aligns with the higher time frames bias. So in this first area right here, let's say we measure the future short strength of this pivot right here and the future long strength of this pivot right here. And we found that there is more long strength than short strength. Now this is in line with the higher time frames bias, right? So in this case, the main stop loss level will be right here, and the main target level will be this pivot high right here. So hypothetically, as price opens right here, we will want to be taking a long trade with this stop loss at this pivot low right here and its main target up at these levels right here. Now at this point, I want you to recall the previous lesson in which we talked about targets should be based on the time frame in which you measure the pivot strength for the entry. So in this case, it will be the daily chart. So although the weekly bias's main stop loss level is at this pivot low right here, and its main target being way up here at this pivot high, even if you did take this long entry, you should be using this time frame stop loss level as well as target levels. And for the time being, the rest of the move to that weekly bias should be used for extensions. Okay, and then in this area right here, we found that the weekly bias was short. So we want to be looking on this daily chart for pivots where there's more short strength than long strength, right? However, as you can see, there are no pullbacks in this area that give us an opportunity so we can measure the future short strength and long strength. All right, so that brings me to number 3. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, number 3. Look to the lower time frames to measure a clear pivot in which the bias aligns with the higher time frames bias. All right. So again, on this daily chart, there are no pivots in this area, or in other words, pullbacks that create pivots in which you can measure the future short strength and the future long strength. So in this case, we want to go to the even lower time frame. So let's go over to the 4-hour chart. Okay, so on this 4-hour chart, that area where the weekly bias is short is this area right here. And as you can see, there's actually pullbacks in price in which we can measure the future short strength and long strength of. So in this case, since we want to be looking for 4-hour pivots where there's more short strength than long strength, so let's use these pivots for example. So let's say that there was more future short strength than long strength between these two pivots, and that's in line with the weekly bias, which is short. Moreover, this also states that the stop loss should be placed at this 4-hour pivot high, while the main target should be at this 4-hour pivot low right here. So in this case, hypothetically, we'll be taking a short trade right here with the stop loss at this pivot high right here and its main target right here. And then moreover, let's say the following pivots also have the same strength differential. So there's more short strength right here than long strength. Then again, hypothetically, you'll take a short trade at this point right here with the stop loss at this pivot high right here and its target being at this 4-hour pivot low right here. Now, since the weekly main target is at this pivot low right here, this entire area all the way to that weekly main target should be used as extensions for the time being. Alright, so that's the basic paradigm in which you would trade a bias change through new pivot strength. Alright, now let's go on to a real life example on the NZD USD pair of a bias change through new pivot strength. Okay. Alright, next slide please. Alright, a real bias change scenario. Number 1, higher time frame bias was measured. Okay. Alright, so we're back on this NZD USD weekly chart. Now, if you watch my forecast and analysis videos, you can recall that the future short strength of this pivot right here was measured against the future long strength of this pivot. And we found that there's more long strength than short strength. So at this point, the weekly bias was stating that price is likely to reach this pivot high up here before reaching this pivot low. And so we were long biased in this area. Okay, so let's go on to the next text. Okay, number 2. The bias changed through new pivot strength. Okay, so unlike the previous example, in real life trading, you'll recall that this pivot right here actually had more future short strength than the prior long pivot's future long strength. So at this point, there was new pivot strength that changed the bias into short. So in other words, at this point, our analysis was stating that price is likely to now reach this pivot low right here before reaching this pivot high. So we'll be looking for short entries. Okay, so let's go on to that final text. Okay, number 3. Then immediately, a new bias's target was hit, thus the bias again changes abruptly. Alright? Now at this point, after a new pivot strength's bias change, the bias was short. However, if you recall in the analysis, I was mentioning that this pivot's short move already hit its target at a monthly gap level that runs right through these levels right here. So at this point, since this short move already hit its main target, the bias again abruptly changed into long. Or in other words, now the analysis was stating that price is likely to reach this pivot high before reaching this pivot low. So as you can see, the bias on the weekly time frame changed from short to long in a matter of 2 weeks. Okay, so let me go ahead and show you this monthly gap level. So let's go over to the monthly chart. Alright, so on this monthly chart, that monthly gap level ran right through these levels right here. Now we measure the future short strength of the weekly short pivot right here against the weekly long pivot right here. And then there was a bias change in this area right here. And as price fell, price hit this monthly gap level target, thus changing the bias into long immediately. And as you can see, this weekly pivot high right here was stopped out at this level right here. Okay, so in this way, in a real life example, you can see that biases could change through new bias strength or even targets. And moreover, even the combination of new pivot strength bias changes and main targets reached can cause biases to change abruptly from short and to long, and vice versa. Alright, and these bias changes through targets reached will be the subject of the next lesson. Okay, alright, next slide. Alright, so in the next lesson, we'll be covering bias changes with targets reached. Again, if you have any questions about this lesson, please leave it in the comments section. And I hope you guys have a great day. And thanks for watching. Goodbye.